John Adams, the second President of the United States, the architect of American independence, and the man whose voice rang out loudest in the Continental Congress on July 4, 1776. He was a lawyer who risked everything to defend British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, and a diplomat who forced Europe to recognize a brand new nation. But behind the facade of a respectable New England gentleman lived an obsession that haunted him his entire life. Adams spent decades digging into his own family tree, trying to prove he came from English nobility. He filled diary pages with the names of ancestors, drew up family trees, and sent letters to archives in England. He was desperate for proof that his roots reached deep into the soil of Devon and Somerset, the land of respectable English yeomen. This obsession bordered on paranoia. Fast forward nearly 200 years, geneticists took DNA samples from Adams' living male descendants and analyzed the Y chromosome, the genetic fingerprint passed down from father to son, unchanged for thousands of years. The results forced historians to rethink everything they knew about the man who signed the Declaration of Independence. John Adams' genetic code turned out to be the code of the very people he was so desperately trying to distance himself from. What had his family actually been hiding for generations? Was he who he claimed to be? And more importantly, did he know the truth about his own origins? To understand the secret hidden in the DNA of America's second president, we have to go back to his stone house in Quincy, Massachusetts.
But first, if you can hit that like button in the next 3 seconds, it shows you love your mom. And if you subscribe to the channel, it means you love your entire family.
It's a cold morning in 1801. 65-year-old Adams, having just lost the election, sits in his study, once again rewriting the history of his lineage. Inside that old house in Quincy, the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. It was a mix of smells that followed John Adams through his long, prickly life. The scent of damp sheep's wool from heavy curtains kept drawn to protect his old books from the sun, and the sharp tang of iron gall ink, a smell that always reminded him of the Boston courtrooms where he once decided people's fates. But above all else was the salty, piercing wind blowing in from the window frames from Massachusetts Bay. That wind brought the smell of rotting seaweed and hope. On his massive oak desk, buried under piles of paper, sat his chipped mug. Inside was cloudy, hard cider. Adams had a mug every morning starting at 5 o'clock, a habit he kept for 40 years. He trusted it more than any doctor's advice, calling it his elixir of cheerfulness and a clear mind. The only sound in the room was the steady, almost mocking scratch of his pen. Adams' fingers, knotty and covered in age spots, shook noticeably. This tremor was his personal curse, and it had started a few years back. Every time the pen slipped, leaving an ugly blotch on the clean parchment, John would let out a low growl like an old dog.
A grandfather clock ticked in the corner, counting down the seconds while seagulls cried outside. Their voices blended with the crashing waves, a reminder that nature doesn't care about the struggles of a man who helped build a nation. The man who argued with kings and helped birth the Declaration of Independence was a walking contradiction. Adams was obsessed with his own nobility, but he saw that nobility in his own, almost painful way. Every spare minute not taken up by politics or letters was spent feverishly searching through family records. He looked for any tiny clue that would link the Adams name to the English gentry, those who had owned land by birthright since the time of the Tudors. His diary, which he kept since 1755, became a monument to his ego and his fears. 50 years of non-stop writing. He wrote so much that the middle finger on his right hand was permanently warped from the pressure of the pen. In his old age, his handwriting, once perfectly clear, turned into an unreadable code. Ink Celtic knots that only he could decipher. At the same time, Adams worked hard to look like a good old Roman. He hated the luxury of the European courts where he served as a diplomat. In Versailles, he felt like a bear in a china shop. He made a point of eating simple boiled cod and baked pumpkin, ignoring fancy French sauces. He couldn't stand powdered wigs, seeing them as a sign of moral decay, and often went out showing his own thinning hair. Yet inside this simple farmer lived a hidden monarchist. This was the same Adams who could spend all day building a stone wall on his farm in Quincy, getting his hands dirty with mud and manure, only to sit down that evening and write a paper arguing that the President of the United States should be called His Highness, the Protector of their liberties. When Congress laughed and rejected the idea, Adams took it as a personal insult that stung for decades. He wanted a republic, but one with the soul of an empire. Boston in March of 1770 didn't look like the birthplace of democracy. It looked like a powder keg that had just been lit. The air in the narrow cobblestone streets smelled like the cold sea, rotting fish, and a new terrifying scent, the sharp, acrid smell of burnt black powder. The snow on King Street, mixed with mud and the blood of 5 killed citizens, had frozen into dark red crusts. Inside his house on Brattle Street, John Adams felt that hatred in his bones. It seeped through the cracks in the doors. It vibrated in the roar of the crowd coming from the docks. His study was cold. He was saving firewood, but the fire in the hearth gave off just enough light to see Abigail's pale face. She sat in her chair, hands over her stomach, pregnant with their 4th child. The older children, Nabby and John Quincy, were asleep upstairs, not yet knowing that their father's world had just split in 2. On the desk in front of Adams lay a request for defense.
Not a single lawyer in Boston, not one loyalist, not one patriot, dared to touch this case. To defend Captain Thomas Preston and his 8 redcoats who had fired into an unarmed crowd, that wasn't just professional suicide. It was a death sentence for his reputation, his family's safety, and his entire future. That night in Adams' study, a drama unfolded that shaped the fate of America more than any battle. Abigail, his dearest friend and the only person whose opinion he valued more than his own, begged him to walk away. She knew Boston. She knew the Sons of Liberty, radicals who didn't think twice about using tar and feathers on anyone they called a traitor. "John, they'll call you a Judas," she whispered, watching him pace the room with his hands behind his back. "They'll burn our house down. Who are you thinking about, justice or your own stubbornness?" Adams stopped. His face, usually round and friendly, looked like it was carved from stone in the fading candlelight. In that moment, a quality surfaced that geneticists 200 years later would link to his Celtic marker of resistance. This wasn't a lawyer's cold calculation. It was an irrational, almost biological refusal to cave to the crowd. If we hang men without a fair trial just because a mob wants blood, how are we better than the tyrants our ancestors ran from? His voice, usually quiet because of his missing teeth, suddenly found the power that would later shake Congress. A council or a court, Abigail? Are we building a nation of laws or a nation of gallows? That same night, the sound of shattering glass tore through the silence of the house. A heavy rock, thrown by a patriotic hand, flew through the window, barely missing the sleeping children. The next morning, Adams stepped onto his porch to find his neighbors looking away. Clients who kept his practice running sent notes cutting ties one after another. He was alone against the whole city. The trial began in an atmosphere that felt like a tribunal in the middle of a plague. The courtroom was packed with angry people, their whispering sounding like a coming storm. Adams was 34. He was in his prime, but this case was draining the life out of him. He looked haggard, his forehead soaked in sweat, and his hands shook from exhaustion and lack of sleep. The prosecution played on emotions. They called witnesses who swore the soldiers fired for the fun of it, that it was a planned slaughter. The crowd cheered every word against the redcoats. But when it was Adams' turn, something incredible happened. He didn't beg for mercy or talk about politics. He did what his people did best.
He gripped onto reality like a Celtic farmer gripping his patch of land. He began to methodically pick the testimony apart, piece by piece. He proved the mob was armed with clubs and ice, that the soldiers were terrified and cornered, and that Captain Preston never gave the order to fire. Then he said the words that would live forever in history books and law schools. Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. At that moment, the courtroom went dead silent. It was the win of reason over rage. Adams, risking everything, his children's lives, his home, his career, forced the jury to see the truth through the fog of hate.
6 soldiers were found not guilty. 2 received the lightest punishment for manslaughter. They were branded on the thumb, which back then was basically a pardon. This story is often told as a classic example of American justice, but DNA analysis gives us a different, deeper look. Why was it Adams? Why not Jefferson with his high-flown ideals, or Washington with his noble calm? Because the R1B L21 code was pulsing in Adams's veins. The code of the outsiders who were used to standing up for their truth when the rest of the world says no. For the Anglo-Saxon or Norman mind, it's about keeping the structure, the hierarchy, and the social peace. No, for a person with that Celtic marker, the truth matters more than fitting in. Defending those soldiers in 1770 wasn't a political move, it was a biological must. Adams simply couldn't do anything else. For centuries, his ancestors had defended their rocky shores against huge odds. They learned to survive alone and not trust the crowd. The same Celtic stubbornness that made Henry Adams hide his past in 1638 now forced his great-grandson to defend his enemies to save the principle of truth. He lost half his income and was called a traitor on every street corner, but he earned something bigger. A reputation as a man who doesn't bend. That quality is exactly why the delegates in Congress would later trust him to write the most important documents of the Revolution. They knew if Adams stands for something, he won't back down, even if the sky falls. But at the same time, his body was a mirror of his inner struggle. Chronic insomnia turned his nights into endless talks with the ghosts of his past. He suffered from black bile, deep bouts of depression where the whole world looked like a gutter. By 50, he had lost almost all his teeth, turning his once powerful voice into a hissing, whistling whisper. He knew he looked ridiculous sweating on the podium, and that vulnerability made him even sharper and more aggressive in arguments. June 1775 in Philadelphia was brutal. The air in the Continental Hall was so thick with humidity and the smell of unwashed bodies that you could almost feel it. Ventilation was a luxury the rebels didn't have. They kept the windows shut so curious locals and British spies couldn't hear the debates that would decide the fate of the 13 colonies. It smelled like rancid hair oil, cheap tobacco, and sour wine. John Adams sat on a hard wooden chair, feeling his wool coat stick to his back. His eyes, red from hours of reading by candlelight, kept drifting to the man standing at the far end of the hall, George Washington. He always chose a spot by the window where the light hit his perfect posture and his blue Virginia militia uniform. Washington almost never said a word, but his silence was louder than any of Adams's speeches. He stood a head taller than everyone else, an athlete, a horseman, a man who looked like he was cast in bronze. While Adams waved his arms, spit flew during his heated points, and he wiped sweat from his balding head, Washington just was. He was the picture of that calm, inherited dignity Adams had searched for so desperately in his imaginary Devonshire ancestors. Adams was a brilliant strategist. He knew that if the Revolution stayed just a fight for loudmouths from Massachusetts, it would fail. To turn a local riot into a national war, he had to get Virginia, the richest and most powerful colony in the South, into the game. And the key to that was Washington.
When John stood up to nominate George as commander-in-chief, he knew he was making a political sacrifice. He saw Washington, hearing his name, walk out of the room with a humble look,
so he wouldn't make the delegates uncomfortable. Adams spoke for a long time, and he was convincing. He wasn't just selling his colleagues a soldier, he was selling them a symbol. But the moment Washington came back and accepted the job with a kingly, almost holy dignity, Adams felt a cold sting. He saw the looks on every delegate's face, even his best friends, instantly shift to this tall Virginian. Adams, the true architect of this moment, suddenly felt like a stagehand who had just finished building a pedestal for a god and now had to step into the shadows so he wouldn't get in the way of the worship. That evening, torn between pride and bitterness, he wrote to Abigail, "I have done it. I have nominated the man who will unite us. But, my dear, I feel that today I created an icon that will overshadow me forever. I am the voice of this Congress, but he is its face, and I fear history will only remember the face." Let's fast forward 22 years. March 4th, 1797, Philadelphia, Independence Hall. John Adams stands at the podium. He is officially becoming the second president of the United States. This should be the high point of his life, the moment his hard work is finally recognized. But the atmosphere in the room felt more like a funeral than a celebration. Standing next to him was Washington, no longer in a military uniform, but in a plain black civilian suit. He was leaving voluntarily, a move never before seen in history. And this last act was once again stealing the show from Adams. John looked at the crowd and saw tears in the eyes of tough politicians. They weren't cheering for Adams, they were mourning the departure of the father of the country. Adams felt like a supporting actor called onto the stage just as the audience started to leave, still buzzing about the lead's performance. His inaugural speech, full of deep meaning and legal precision, was drowned out by the sounds of sniffing and quiet sobbing for Washington. When he got back to his room that night, Adams opened his diary. His pen scratched against the paper with a particular anger. "It is over. I am president." But I saw their faces. They looked at him like the setting sun, and at me like a dim moon that only reflects his light. I have the throne, but the crown stays on a ghost's head. I will lead a country that is dreaming of someone else. Why did Adams take Washington's greatness so hard? The answer isn't just political jealousy. It's about that same genetic conflict that tore at him his whole life. George Washington was the image of the English ideal. His family tree was clear, his manners were perfect, and his right to lead seemed as natural as the seasons changing. In the eyes of society, he was the true gentry, a descendant of Norman or Anglo-Saxon knights. He didn't have to prove he belonged at the top. He just was. Adams, carrying the R1B L21 code, felt like a Celtic upstart, even if he didn't realize it. For centuries, his ancestors had survived on the edges. They were the black sheep of British history.
His obsession with finding noble roots in depth was an attempt to build a genetic bridge to put himself on the same level as Washington. He wanted to find that same legitimacy, that same quiet strength in his own blood. His inferiority complex was the fuel for his ambition. If Washington led people with a look, Adams had to lead them with his brain, endless work, and a total obsession with history. He wrote his diaries and letters in such detail because he was afraid that if he didn't document his own importance, the shadow of the great Virginian would simply erase him from memory. It was a clash of two DNA types: the stable aristocrat who owns the world by birthright, and the Celtic survivor who has to fight for every inch of respect, always suspecting he'll be seen as number two. John Adams spent 4 years as president fighting Washington's shadow within himself. He tried to be more Washingtonian than Washington, passing tough laws and demanding titles. But the more he tried to act like an English aristocrat, the more his true Celtic side came out: stubborn, emotional, and unwilling to compromise with reality. While John Adams was laying the foundation for the American government, the political scene in Philadelphia became a torture chamber for him. The press didn't just criticize him, they systematically tore him down. At the request of his former friend and now bitter enemy, Thomas Jefferson,
Journalist James Callender called Adams a hideous hermaphrodite, a creature lacking both and political will. In taverns and parlors, people whispered that the president was a secret fan of the British crown, that he traveled to Europe too much and spent too much time with nobles. They claimed he had already arranged a marriage between his son, John Quincy, and the daughter of George to turn America back into a colony. Every word hit Adams like a hot needle. He didn't know how to brush off criticism. He kept a special folder where he carefully saved the nastiest articles about himself, rereading them at night as if trying to harden his anger. While John Adams spent 10 years navigating the mirrored halls of Versailles and the foggy canals of Amsterdam trying to get loans for the young republic, the real center of his world was in Quincy. While John breathed in the scent of expensive wigs and powder, Abigail Adams breathed in the smell of damp earth, fresh hay, and unwashed sheep's wool. Her world wasn't made of diplomatic bows. Her world was a rocky farm that she carried on her own shoulders. John would send excited letters from Europe about political philosophy, and Abigail would write back about the price of manure, sick livestock, and how she was handling the inflation that was eating their savings all by herself. Her hands, which once played the harpsichord, became the hands of a farm woman, calloused, with dirt worked deep into the skin. But it was those hands that kept Adams afloat. She wasn't just a wife, she was his venture capitalist. While John spent money on appearances, Abigail secretly invested in land and government bonds, being more calculated than London bankers. She was his eyes and ears in America, the only person whose gut feeling he trusted more than his own. At the peak of the Adams presidency in 1790, the young republic was on the edge of disaster. Relations with revolutionary France were at a breaking point.
Adams, stuck in his stuffy office, was torn between pressure from the elite and his own fear of looking like a weak leader. The order for general mobilization was already on his desk. His pen was ready to sign, but at that exact moment, a letter arrived from Quincy. Abigail didn't write about strategy. She wrote about what she saw from her farmhouse window. She told him about farmers who couldn't pay their taxes, mothers who were terrified for their sons, and the fact that the people didn't want to die for the ambitions of politicians. She told him what his advisors were hiding. The country was exhausted. The price of bread was rising, and a full-scale war would be a death sentence for America. Adams read that letter several times. In those lines, he saw more than just a wife's advice. He heard the voice of the land he came from. The next morning, he did something that people at the time called political suicide. He canceled the mobilization and sent a new peace mission to France. He saved the country from a ruinous war, but overnight he became an outcast in his own party. Hamilton's followers were furious. They started calling him a traitor and Abigail Mrs. President, hinting that a woman in a bonnet was running the country, not a man in a uniform. The rumors about Abigail's influence weren't groundless. In Philadelphia's political circles, people whispered that no appointment or important law moved forward without the lady from Massachusetts saying yes. They called her an old witch, a queen, and an invisible dictator. But Adams just smirked at the attacks. In a rare moment of honesty, he told his secretary, "If I could choose only one advisor to run this nation, I would choose her, even if it meant firing my entire cabinet." Their union wasn't a romantic fairy tale. It was a strategic partnership between two Atlantic Celts.
Their shared success wasn't the result of good breeding. It was a product of biological endurance. They were both hardwired for long-term survival in a world with few resources and too many enemies. That's why Adams could stand his ground against Hamilton, against Jefferson, and against the entire British Empire. Behind him stood Abigail, his invisible president. But the hardest hits didn't come from politics, they came from life itself. 1800 was his personal apocalypse. In the middle of a brutal presidential campaign, he got word that his middle son, Charles, had died. Handsome and talented, Charles had literally drank himself to death at 30, becoming a shell of his former self. In a fit of rage and grief, Adams wrote in his diary, "I renounce him. He is no longer my son." But that was a lie.
For the rest of his life, he heard Charles's crying in the sound of the rain, blaming himself because his obsession with the state left his children without a father. His second son, Thomas, was on the same path of self-destruction, and his favorite daughter, Nabby, was fading away in an unhappy marriage, fighting cancer at a time when medicine was just another form of torture. At the core of how John Adams saw himself was a single legend, the story of Henry Adams. According to family lore, this tough, righteous man arrived in Massachusetts Bay in 1638 from the heart of England, Devonshire. For John, this wasn't just family history, it was his political. He believed he carried ancient free English blood, the blood of yeomen who didn't bow to tyrants but lived by the law. Adams spent huge amounts of money, the little he had left, hiring professional researchers in England. He demanded they find Henry Adams' baptism records, find the estate, find a coat of arms. He wanted to prove to everyone, and mostly to himself, that he wasn't some upstart from the American backwoods, but the rightful heir to a great tradition. But the archives were silent. In the Devonshire church records for those years, there was no mention of a Henry Adams who fit the family seemed to appear out of nowhere, materialized on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic. No marriage records, no property deeds, nothing. A cold, echoing emptiness that haunted John Adams in his sleep. He filled that void with thousands of pages of writing, as if trying to build a fortress of paper where there was no foundation. John Adams left behind over 60,000 pages of writing, a massive amount of data about his thoughts, fears, and political moves. He documented every breath of his century. But the irony of history is that the most important, most private information about him wasn't written in ink on paper. It was written with 4 chemical bases inside every cell of his body. For centuries, historians couldn't solve the mystery of the Devonshire silence, but the truth didn't need paper. It was hiding in a drop of blood from his direct descendants. What geneticists found in 2010 didn't just tweak his biography, it blew up the official story of noble English roots the Adams family had been building for 300 years. It turns out the man who spent his whole life trying to prove he belonged to the English elite carried the code of the people the English had tried to wipe out for centuries, the code of the people called wild Celts and an inferior race in London coffeehouses.
John Adams' body rests under heavy granite slabs in the Church of the Presidents in Quincy. The place smells of cold stone and frozen time. For almost 200 years, only the vault walls and the country's respect guarded his rest. But in 2010, the silence was broken not by shovels, but by the cold calculations of modern science. A group of geneticists working on the Founding Fathers' DNA project faced a choice. They could have asked to exhume the body to get a piece of bone or a tooth from Adams himself. But why disturb his rest when history left an easier path? The direct male line of the Adams family is a living archive. The Y chromosome, passed from father to son, is like a baton that doesn't change color or shape for thousands of years. It doesn't mix with the mother's DNA. It isn't watered down by time. Scientists track down living descendants of John Adams. Imagine the scene: a modern suburb, an ordinary house, and a man carrying the same genetic signature as the man who argued with King George. Taking a sample meant getting access to the president's own blood through a 200-year time gap. When the DNA samples reached the lab in Houston, the air was electric. There was no room for political bias or historical myths here. The sequencing process was like high-tech archaeology. First, they broke down the cell walls to release the precious DNA strands. Then came the cleaning, separating the genetic material from proteins and microscopic junk. What was left was a clear liquid, the software code of life. The experts were looking for specific markers, short tandem repeats. These define the haplogroup, the ancient last name nature gave the Adams line long before people learned to write. The scientific world expected to see the English standard. For the east coast of Britain, where Adams's ancestor supposedly came from, you usually see markers like R106, BU106, Germanic or Anglo-Saxon, or I1,
the legacy of the Vikings. Everyone was sure the test would confirm the noble Saxon roots of the second president, but the result didn't just miss the mark. It contradicted John Adams' entire official biography. RB1L21. Those letters and numbers hit historians like a bolt of lightning. The lab techs thought there was a mistake. Maybe the sample was contaminated. They ran the test again. 3 independent checks gave the same verdict. To understand how big of a disaster this was for the Adams family myth, you have to know what L21 is. In eastern England, in Devonshire, this marker is extremely rare. It's a statistical fluke, but if you move west to Ireland, the mountains of Wales, or the Scottish Highlands, the concentration of L21 skyrockets. In Western Ireland, up to 40% of men carry it. It is the genetic signature of the Gaelic Celts, the very people the English crown spent centuries trying to conquer and break. The people 17th century Puritans called raw barbarians and second-class citizens. The man who built his identity on being pure English gentry was carrying the blood of the people the English looked down on most. The L21 code in Adams's blood isn't just a dry number. It's a map of an epic journey that started long before the first cities. To trace this path, we have to go back 25,000 years to the harsh steppes between the Caspian and Black Seas.
That's where the R1b haplogroup started. These were Bronze Age people, nomadic herders who were the first to domesticate horses and build fast chariots. Their move west was an unstoppable wave that washed away old Europe. About 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, one branch of this group split off and headed for the very edge of the known world, the British Isles. This branch, called L21, became the master of the Atlantic. While other R1b groups settled in Germany or France, Adam's ancestors pushed through the fog to the rocky shores of Britain and Ireland. They brought their languages, later called Celtic, their fury, and their unbreakable will to live. But history played a trick on them. When the Romans came, and later the waves of Anglo-Saxon and Danish invaders, the L21 people didn't mix with them. They were pushed back. They went into the mountains of Wales, the bogs of Ireland, and the misty valleys of Scotland. They became the outer ring, the edge that civilized London saw as a wild wasteland. Adam's genes are genes of resistance. This is the blood of people who lived under siege for centuries, keeping their identity against all odds. Now imagine how historians felt when they compared this Celtic code to what happened in 1638. Henry Adams, the president's great-great-grandfather, arrives in Massachusetts. He calls himself an Englishman from Devon. He does everything to fit into the Puritan society of New England, where Irish or Welsh people were looked at with a suspicion that was close to hate. Back then, Irish wasn't just a nationality, it was a label. It meant you belonged to wild people prone to riots. For a man dreaming of making it in a Puritan colony, admitting to Celtic roots was social suicide. The puzzle starts to fit together. The silence of the English archives in Devonshire makes sense now. Henry Adams didn't just get lost in the paperwork. Most likely, he cut the ties on purpose. He changed his identity like an old coat, putting on the mask of a proper Englishman. He erased his Celtic past so his sons could become presidents. John Adams, the man who was so proud of his ancient English blood, was actually a descendant of people who survived on the fringes of the... In his veins flowed the blood of Celtic chiefs and warriors, not peaceful English farmers. His stubbornness, his mood swings, his temper, and his fanatical drive for freedom, it all suddenly makes sense. It was the voice of ancestors he tried to silence, but who ultimately made him great. When the results were finally confirmed, it was clear the entire Adams family tree was a massive, carefully built fake created out of fear of discrimination. But this discovery led to an even creepier question. If Henry Adams hid his past so carefully in 1638, does that mean the whole history of the American elite is built on this kind of genetic camouflage? And the most intriguing part,
What if John Adams subconsciously knew the R1b L21 haplogroup found in John Adams' genetic code isn't just some dry statistic? It's a biological record of a people who spent 3,000 years mastering the art of survival at the very edge of the world. When geneticists saw this marker, they didn't see an English gentleman. They saw the archetype of the Atlantic man. The Celts of the Western Atlantic were people whose character was forged where nature itself tried to kill them. They were farmers digging into the rocky, barren soil of Ireland and Wales. They were sailors heading out into the stormy Atlantic in tiny boats, knowing the ocean doesn't forgive mistakes. For centuries, people tried to wipe them out. First, the Roman legions, then the Anglo-Saxons and Danish invaders. But the L21 people didn't give up. They didn't disappear into their conquerors. They adapted, lay low, and waited for their time. Looking at John Adams' political career through the lens of L21, we don't just see a stubborn American. We see the awakening of that ancient Celtic fury. That almost irrational iron will he showed in the Continental Congress makes sense now. Think of 1776. Philadelphia is melting in the heat. Delegates are terrified of the British Navy, and half the room is whispering about making a deal and asking for mercy. And in the middle of that whispering, Adams's voice rises, sharp, not fancy, but as hard as granite. They called him the Atlas of Independence. That wasn't a politician's act. It was the voice of survivor ancestors who knew that when an empire pins you against a rock, you only have one choice: stand your ground.
His stubborn principles in the 1770 Boston Massacre case are another prime example of this genetic legacy, defending British soldiers who shot civilians in a city hungry for blood. That was political suicide. Any sensible English gentleman worried about his reputation would have walked away, but Adams stood his ground against everyone. In that moment, the Celtic protector of the community woke up inside him, the man for whom law and truth stand far above the opinion of the mob. He risked becoming a total outcast, and people threw rocks at his house, but he didn't back down an inch. His legendary work ethic, the ability to spend 12 to 14 hours a day in exhausting negotiations with arrogant European monarchs, facing humiliating rejections in Versailles or The Hague, and returning the next morning with that same icy calm, wasn't just upbringing. It was the biological rhythm of a people used to a long siege. He didn't expect easy wins. He knew the soil was rocky and the sea was stormy, and the only way to survive was to keep rowing. Even his famous, almost obsessive diary keeping takes on a new, deep meaning now. 60,000 pages of text. Why? Psychologists might call it narcissism. Historians was worried about his legacy. But genetics offers a different answer. John Adams was creating a written history of his lineage in real time because his oral, ancestral memory had been forcibly erased. His family arrived in New England as people without a past, without church records or roots. A deep subconscious feeling of this void behind him forced him to record every step and every thought. He was building a paper castle for his identity, never realizing that the true foundation of that castle wasn't in England, but in the misty Celtic lands he was afraid to even think about. So did John Adams know the truth about where he came from? Did he ever look into the abyss that separated him from noble Devonshire? Most likely, not consciously, but he couldn't help cold draft coming from the past. That void in the English archives he tried so hard to fill by hiring researchers wasn't an accident. It was the trail of a deliberate act of genetic desertion. To understand why this happened, we have to go back to 1638. Henry Adams, the president's great-great-grandfather, steps ashore in Massachusetts. Around him is harsh Puritan New England. At that time in Britain and its colonies, being Irish or Welsh meant carrying a stigma. Catholic Celts were seen by the English establishment as no better than savages. There were laws that allowed the Irish to be sold into permanent service, basically slavery, right alongside people from Africa. They were forbidden from owning land, holding public office, or even speaking their native language.
Henry Adams, carrying the L21 haplogroup, understood if he brought the truth about his origins with him, his children would stay at the bottom of society forever. So he did the boldest thing of his life. He erased himself. He invented the legend of Devonshire, of sturdy English yeomen and Protestant piety. That lie was an act of ultimate love for his descendants. It worked perfectly for 200 years. It allowed John Adams to graduate from Harvard, become a lawyer, and eventually become president. If anyone in 1796 had proven that dirty Irish Papist blood flowed in Adams's veins, his political career would have ended before it started. His enemies, who called him an upstart, instinctively felt something was off, but they didn't have the tools to prove it. And here lies the great paradox. Was John Adams a great American? Absolutely. But his greatness didn't come from the nobility he looked for in dusty London books. His greatness was the triumph of will over circumstances. He wasn't an English gentleman of noble blood. He was the son of a man who tricked history to give his children a chance. The truth revealed in 2010 didn't diminish his memory. It made his story more human and more powerful. It's a story about how, from the ashes of an erased past, through sheer strength of spirit and the wrong genes, a person is born who can change the course of human civilization. John Adams lived for 90 years and 247 days. In an era where the average life expectancy was barely over 40 and 50-year-olds were considered ancient, his longevity didn't just look like an anomaly. It looked like divine intervention or some kind of scary biological magic. This record among American presidents stood for nearly 2 centuries until it was finally broken in 2018 by George W.H. Bush, who had the full power of modern medicine, antibiotics, and cardiology.
But Adams had nothing but his iron stubbornness and a morning cup of cider. Look at his medical history. He survived smallpox, suffered through bouts of malaria, then called marsh fever, lost every single tooth by age 50 due to primitive dentistry, and spent his last decades with an uncontrollable tremor. His body was literally falling apart, but the fire inside him burned like a blacksmith's forge. Today, geneticists studying long-lived populations have noticed an interesting pattern. Carriers of the R1b-L21 haplogroup, especially in the coastal areas of Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, show a statistically higher resistance to certain types of age-related wear and tear. This genetic marker is the legacy of people who lived for centuries under extreme stress, poor nutrition, and constant battles with infections on the Atlantic coast. Through natural selection, their DNA locked in gene variations responsible for higher resistance to inflammation and a high stress tolerance threshold. What Adams called his black bile, depression, and stubbornness were just side effects of a powerful nervous system built for decades of struggle. His daily habits only boosted this genetic program. Adams was a fanatic about his routine. Every morning for 40 years started with a mug of hard apple cider. Modern nutritionists can only shake their heads. The unfiltered cider of that time was packed with antioxidants and polyphenols that literally cleaned the old politicians' arteries. Add to that a simple farmer's diet: boiled cod, root vegetables, no extra sugar, and physical labor. Until he was 80, Adams personally went out into his fields, hauled rocks for fences, and inspected every inch of his land. He didn't know the obesity that killed off many of his aristocratic peers. His body was lean, tough, and functional. The irony of history peaks here. The very inferior Celtic code John Adams tried so hard to hide under the mask of an English gentleman became his greatest biological advantage. His wild ancestors gave him a body that allowed him to outlive all his friends and enemies, watching as the country he helped create became a world power. The genetic relay didn't stop with John. His son, John Quincy Adams, became the 6th president of the U.S., creating the country's first political dynasty. But if the father was a rough Celt trying to pass as an Englishman, the son became a refined intellectual whose mind worked like a perfect machine. John Quincy was even more obsessed with his origins than his father. He spent years organizing the family archives and writing a multi-volume family history. And he hit the same brick wall in the English records. Unable to find the truth in documents, he seems to have started looking for it in sounds. There's an interesting fact that historians long brushed off as just a genius's quirk. John Quincy Adams was fluent in 7 languages. But among the Latin, French, and German, 2 strange choices stood out: Welsh and Gaelic, Irish. Officially, he called it a philological exercise to train the mind. But imagine the scene: the President of the United States, in the silence of his study, reading ancient Welsh sagas in a language that had nothing to do with noble Devonshire. It was like a subconscious call of the blood. It was as if the DNA locked inside the American politician's body demanded he hear the rhythm and melody of the words his true ancestors spoke before Henry Adams erased their story in 1638. The tragedy of the Adams dynasty was its fragility. Out of John Adams's 4 children, only John Quincy was able to continue the direct male line that didn't snap under the weight of depression and illness. The Celtic black bile took its toll on the Adams. Alcoholism, melancholy, and early deaths haunted the Adamses, almost like a price for their incredible energy. Yet one thin thread survived it all. The Adams male line made it through the Civil War, the Great Depression, and the wild 20th century. And it was because of this surviving lineage that geneticists in 2010 were able to get that Y chromosome sample. If John Quincy hadn't had the same biological survival instinct as his father, Henry Adams' secret would have stayed buried in the archives forever. John Adams searched for his roots in archives, but he found them in the blood of his grandsons. It turns out that America is a country built not by aristocrats, but by those who managed to hide their past to create a great future. Have you ever taken a DNA test to see whose blood is actually pumping through your veins? Do you know where your ancestors really came from? Your DNA is more than just a string of nucleotides. It is the most accurate record on the planet, one with no room for political censorship or human forgetfulness.
Today, technology allows each of us to lead our own molecular investigation. A simple cheek swab can wipe away centuries of misconceptions in a second. It opens the door to a world where you aren't just someone with a last name, but the heir to a vast and ancient migration, the result of incredible encounters and chance unions. But what if Adams wasn't the only one? What if other founding fathers carried secrets they would have rather taken to the grave? In the next chapter, we'll see how DNA exposes another leader whose legend was built on denying his true nature.